On Friday, Washington, D.C. will host a high-level meeting where U.S. President Donald Trump is set to welcome Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev and Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. According to reliable sources' report to Middle East Eye, the leaders are expected to sign a memorandum of understanding, a letter of intent rather than a fully binding peace treaty, following their recent talks in Abu Dhabi. It is also noteworthy to add that, after that meeting, both leaders indicated that their countries could finalize the main principles of the agreement within a few months and then proceed to initial it. Yerevan and Baku have neither confirmed nor denied the details of the agenda, but the White House ceremony is already being viewed as a symbolic milestone in the peace process. This event is being framed by some as a diplomatic win for Washington, a fast, visible sign of progress in a region that has seen repeated cycles of ceasefires and renewed violence. But experts warn that symbolism without enforcement can be dangerous here. Geopolitical analyst Irina Tsukerman cautions that a White House MOU could be more theater than settlement, and that theater can have violent consequences.
Memorandum of Understanding, particularly one brokered by the Trump administration, carries major symbolic weight, but intentionally lacks binding legal substance. In the tradition of Trump's deal-making style, as articulated in his book The Art of the Deal, optics, narrative control, and the illusion of victory often take precedence over complex implementation details. This makes an MOU ideal for political theater. It suggests momentum without requiring immediate sacrifices. For Washington, this is a diplomatic quick win. For the parties involved, it's a way to posture as cooperative without fundamentally resolving deep-rooted grievances. Yet therein lies the danger. In the South Caucasus, a region where promises without enforcement have a bloody legacy, symbolism without substance can backfire dramatically. Previous examples abound. The 1994 Bishkek Protocol, also signed as a ceasefire memorandum, froze rather than resolved what was then known as the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, sowing the seeds for future wars. The 2020 Russian brokered ceasefire similarly left crucial points like the final status of Karabakh or the so-called Zangezur corridor deliberately vague, triggering new crises in 2022 and 2023. If Trump facilitates a similar non-committal document now, it risks repeating the cycle of temporary calm followed by renewed aggression. Moreover, an MOU signed at the White House rather than in Brussels or Moscow sends a geopolitical signal. It would be framed as a US-led reset of the regional order, potentially sidelining both Russia and the EU. But that also means the US would inherit partial responsibility for future failures, something Trump historically tries to avoid. His preference for wins without post-agreement maintenance, see also North Korea, Taliban talks, or even the Abraham Accords, could leave the region in a dangerous vacuum once the cameras are off and the applause fades. We also must assess what kind of MOU is being discussed. If it merely reiterates intentions to keep negotiating, as has already happened in Prague, Sochi, and Abu Dhabi, then it risks redundancy. If it contains specific commitments, such as border demarcation principles or guarantees of minority rights, then the absence of enforcement will become a glaring issue. Neither side trusts the other, and the symbolic document without teeth could unravel quickly on the ground. The implications are high stakes. A White House MOU could create momentum, internationalize the process, and marginalize Moscow, or it could accelerate domestic backlash, deepen public cynicism, and expose Armenia to new concessions that could lead to additional domestic turmoil. It could also force Azerbaijan into new concessions without clear reciprocity. For Pashinyan, the difference between those outcomes could determine his political survival. Armenia's ties with Russia are not merely historical, they're structural. Since its independence in 1991, Armenia has relied on Russia for air defense, border security, discounted energy, and the perception of a nuclear umbrella in the face of Turkey and Azerbaijan. The presence of a Russian military base in Gyumri and Armenia's membership in the CSTO symbolized that dependence, but Moscow's visible apathy towards Armenian security in the wake of the 2020 war and again during the 2022 clashes has shattered the illusion of that alliance. Pashinyan's response has been to pivot, first cautiously, now more openly towards the West. His decision to host US military drills in Armenia deepened ties with France and flirt with EU and NATO partnerships, which has been interpreted by the Kremlin as betrayal. But for Yerevan, it's survival. The challenge is whether Armenian public opinion is ready to support this pivot. Many in Armenia remain deeply skeptical of Western commitment, especially watching how quickly the West abandoned Afghanistan or failed to prevent uh, the Russian incursion and war in Ukraine in 2022. If Pashinyan signs a US brokered MOU without ironclad security guarantees, such as defense cooperation, arms sales, or permanent monitoring mission, he risks being seen as trading one unreliable partner for another. The domestic opposition, including nationalist elements and former regime loyalists, is already weaponizing this narrative. The argument is clear. Pashinyan has alienated Russia without securing anything concrete from the West in return, and now risks further territorial and geopolitical concessions. We must also examine Pashinyan's broader legitimacy crisis. After the 2020 defeat, he narrowly survived politically because of his perceived independence and because Russia was blamed equally, if not more. But if Trump hosts Aliyev and Pashinyan in Washington, and an MOU emerges that favors Azerbaijan's demands, such as unimpeded transit across southern Armenia, no mention of Karabakh autonomy, and vague promises on minority rights, then the backlash in Yerevan could be severe. Now, of course, Azerbaijan is risking just as much if this reciprocity from Armenia does not materialize in MOU. But for Azerbaijan, that would not be an issue of a domestic attempt to launch a coup, the way it would be in Armenia after failed attempts that we know of so far. In a worst-case scenario, domestic protests could reignite with greater coordination and external backing. Unlike 2020, when Russia sought to preserve Pashinyan as a weak but manageable leader, Moscow today welcomes regime change in Armenia and actually pushes for it. The political stakes are existential for Armenia, or at least for Pashinyan's government. If this MOU is perceived as capitulation under Western pressure, Pashinyan may not survive it, politically or perhaps even physically. Let's be blunt, this is a high-risk, high-reward gambit for all parties involved, but especially for Armenia. The Trump administration likely views the South Caucasus as an exploitable vacuum, a place where it can outmaneuver Russia, showcase American deal-making prowess, and declare a foreign policy win in a region long ignored by Democrats. For Trump, it would fit the model seen with the Abraham Accords, transactional diplomacy between actors surrounded by non-democratic neighbors with limited interest on his part in liberal norms, but strong interest in prestige, defense contracts, and survival of the governments. The ingredients that made the Abraham Accords possible, namely shared fear of Iran, U.S. arms incentives, and the absence of unresolved ethnic wars, are not quite present here. The Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict is raw, recent, and deeply asymmetric. Aliyev has the upper hand militarily and diplomatically. Pashinyan is under siege at home and abroad. Trump's approach, maximizing spectacle while avoiding structural commitments, could worsen this imbalance. He may try to sell arms to both sides, extract diplomatic concessions, and then disengage when complications arise. Furthermore, expectations from Azerbaijan and Armenia are wildly divergent. Aliyev wants full recognition of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, transit corridors, and closure of the Karabakh file, without further obligations. Armenia wants U.S. security assurances, border recognition, and what it calls minority protection without changing its constitution or addressing Azerbaijan's demands about the return of Azerbaijani citizens who were expelled in the past, ideally guaranteed by Western powers. A U.S. brokered MOU will likely lean closer to Aliyev's version, especially if Trump views Azerbaijan as the stronger, more reliable regional actor as he did with Saudi Arabia and Turkey during his first term. My expectation is that the MOU, if it materializes, would be ambiguous, non-binding, and heavily spun as a breakthrough. It may reference border delimitation, regional connectivity, and mutual recognition of sovereignty, but it will likely avoid contentious details such as the status of Sinuk, rights of displaced peoples, international monitoring. This ambiguity will create fertile ground for future disputes, especially if the West doesn't follow up with real engagement or peacekeeping mechanisms. In other words, this may be less a peace process than a performance on Trump's part. If history is any guide, from the failed Trump-Kim summits to the Taliban agreement in Doha, Trump's model of diplomacy prizes the short-term spectacle over long-term stability. Applied to the South Caucasus, that's not just flawed strategy, it's dangerous.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Azerbaijan, Matthew Briza, on the other hand, sees the White House meeting as a real chance for momentum in Baku-Washington relations. If Washington can turn goodwill into concrete steps,
It does seem that something positive is happening in U.S.-Azerbaijan relations, though it's difficult to figure out exactly what that is. I first noticed the improvement in the Trump administration a couple of months ago when President Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who really is Trump's lead negotiator when it comes to conflicts, whether it be in the Middle East or Russia, Ukraine, visited Baku. There wasn't a lot of reporting about Mr. Witkoff's visit, but the mere fact that he showed up indicated to me that President Trump is interested in playing some sort of a role in helping Azerbaijan and Armenia reach a final peace treaty. And in fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago reporting similarly. President Trump very much wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize. I think he sees an opportunity in the progress that's been made in negotiations between Baku and Yerevan on finalizing a peace treaty. I know for a fact that both leaders, both President Aliyev and Prime Minister Pashinyan, want to resolve the final issues, especially the question of Armenia amending its constitution to make clear it recognizes Karabakh unequivocally as part of Azerbaijan. But the U.S. doesn't really have a direct negotiating role, and the Minsk Group is no longer really. I mean, its dissolution is part of the peace treaty that's being negotiated now between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So there's not a formal U.S. negotiating role, but I think President Trump would like to find a way to play some role. There hasn't been a clear sign of any shift in U.S. foreign policy when it comes to the South Caucasus, other than that Witkoff visit, which I welcome. And then there was the exchange of nice statements by President Aliyev first in Baku and then during the Global Media Forum. And then President Trump reciprocated by saying nice things about President Aliyev and Azerbaijan. But that's, so far that's all we've really seen in terms of new statements or new actions out of Washington. And what this means in the longer run for U.S.-Azerbaijan relations improving further is unknowable at this point, because President Trump shifts his approaches to world leaders and to countries very quickly, as we see in the case of India and Narendra Modi, whereby Trump and Modi have been apparently friends for years. And then President Trump announced on Friday a very high tariff rate for India. So hopefully President Trump will sustain his interest and affinity for Azerbaijan, and then we'll see what kind of role the United States might want to play in the South Caucasus. Now, there's one last point, is that, of course, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey and special envoy for Syria, Tom Barrack, made an announcement several weeks ago, in June, in fact, on the 17th, that the Trump administration would like to see an American logistics company operating the Zangezur corridor, and he talked about a lease, a 100-year lease to such an American company. I think the leasing idea is a non-starter. That's not going to work, because neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan, for any parts of the Zangezur corridor that might be in Azerbaijan's territory, wants to lease away its sovereignty for 100 years or for even one day. After all, both countries, Azerbaijan and Armenia, have fought two wars precisely over the question of the sovereignty of territory. So I think the property develops that are at the center of Donald Trump's foreign policy operation thought of a lease as something that happens in property deals in the United States and figured, well, why not do that for the Zangezur corridor? That model's not going to work. But of course, the U.S. together with Azerbaijan and Armenia can find a different way that a U.S. logistics company could possibly operate the corridor on the basis of, well, an operational agreement rather than a lease. But all that, is being discussed behind closed doors, and there's a real lack of clarity on where all of these ideas stand right now.